Mary Williford with the Coastal Voices Project, the Fisheries Reform Act project. It is June 26, 2016 at about 4:15 in the afternoon. We are here in Bear Creek, North Carolina with BJ Copeland. Again, my name is Mary Williford, MaryWilliford. So BJ, can you say and spell your name?
My name is B.J. Copeland, and it's B.J.Copeland.
All right, well, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview for the Fisheries Reform Act project. Can you start out by telling us where and when you were born and where you grew up?
Okay, I was born November 20th, 1936, in a country home near Mansville, Oklahoma. That's Mannsville, Oklahoma. And I grew up there, went to school at Mansville Consolidated District Number 3. From there I went to Oklahoma State University, where I obtained my undergraduate and graduate degrees. My first job was at the University of Texas at their Marine Institute. I was there for 7.5 years. In January 1970, I came to North Carolina as an associate professor at NC State University, and I retired from NC State University in 2002, so I was there for a while. And let's see, I became the director of Sea Grant College in 1973. Until 1996. That's about all the background.
What were your degrees in?
I have an undergraduate degree in biology and chemistry, and my PhD degree is in limnology. I study of freshwater, and so I went to the University of Texas to see if salt water was the same as fresh water, and indeed it is, except for a little bit of salt.
All right, so you taught for a living? What did you do for a living?
I'm not quite sure.
You managed to make a living.
I was what you call a research scientist at the University of Texas, and we worked in Texas and Central America and Mexico and Puerto Rico and so on. Mostly on water quality issues. My claim to fame, I guess, is the study of Galveston Bay in Texas, where the state of Texas was concerned about the level of pollution in Galveston Bay, and through our research there, they were able to make some changes and improve the water quality of Galveston Bay, which is a large bay system in Texas. I came to North Carolina mainly because of the beginning of a marine science program jointly between NC State, UNC, Chapel Hill, Duke, and UNC Wilmington. And we were trying to start a graduate program in marine sciences. And so I was a researcher and a professor in the zoology department, botany department, and the new marine sciences program. The new Marine Sciences program finally became a Department of Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences in later years at NC State, but in the early days it was just a program. Well, after I left Sea Grant in 1996, I went back into the zoology department at NC State, where I taught a couple of courses and worked on some papers, books, and stuff, and became the graduate administrator for zoology department.
So how did you get involved with fisheries management, fisheries resources?
Well, mainly as in our research program, we were looking at water quality and habitat, which leads you into the fisheries issue. And then when I became director of Sea Grant, that broadened everything so that we began to have programs in fisheries management of all sorts. Commercial fishery, recreational fishing interactions, management of fisheries, how things worked, how we could translate research into management things and that sort of stuff. So one thing just kind of led to another. So there we are. And then I got into fisheries management for real when I was appointed to the Marine Fisheries Commission in the 1980s, the so-called Egghead Commission. And when Jim Martin was governor, he decided that what we needed to do was to increase the intellectual capacity in the Marine Fisheries Commission, as in all commissions that he was interested in. Jim Martin, as you know, was a PhD chemist from Davidson University to begin with. And so that was kind of a disaster, because a bunch of eggheads trying to manage things is not a very good way to get there. We had lots of arguments but little action. So I served on that commission for 4 years, I guess it was, or 5. And that finally, the whole thing got dissolved. I mean, the state government decided that commissions weren't really the way to go, so the Marine Fisheries Commission was actually dissolved, and they started over again. And so there was legislative action to create a new commission, which kept getting things added to and added to and added to. So we had a 19-member Marine Fisheries Commission.
What year was that?
I think that was 1984, in the mid-'80s anyway. And that was also a disaster, because 19 people can't make any kind of decision. We just argued a lot. And so what happened with the Fisheries Moratorium Act, I mean, that's one of the factors. That we had a unwieldy commission, no way to get there. We had regulations right and left, none of which were related to others. People were kind of fed up with the whole idea. And so the fisheries moratorium came because they wanted to stop, look, consider, and really come up with something. And so we had a 3-year moratorium on anything, on any regulation, on any activity, any new activity. And that resulted in the Fisheries Reform Act of 1996. So that's how we got there. I was a member of the commission before. A member of the moratorium steering committee. And then when we formed the new commission with 9 members, I became a member of that commission appointed by Governor Jim Hunt. So there it is.
So you had mentioned Governor Martin being very interested in forming these sort of committees you said the egghead committees. Do you think there were any other factors that led him or led the the North Carolina legislature to have a particular interest in fisheries management at that time?
Well, there was a lot of argument concerning allocation of resources. I mean, at about that time when we began to have increase in population and increase in interest of things on the coast, there were a lot of factors, and so the issue of who owned the fish and what did you do with them became much more prominent. And recreational fishing began to rapidly increase. We've always had commercial fishing for the last 400 years probably, and ever since the Indians and Sir Walter Raleigh traded fish for bulldogs, we've had commercial fishing. And so the emphasis then became much more pointed into who and how to allocate fish to. And we've not solved that problem yet, but we're still working on it.
So you mentioned that you were part of the Moratorium Committee as well as the larger group from 94 to 97. Can you tell me about sort of what what your role there was. What sort of help or guidance were you providing?
Well, the Moratorium Steering Committee was, the considerable effort made to have representation from all interest groups. All stakeholders would be involved. And as the director of Sea Grant, I kind of represented the research and information and extension kind of constituency. And so I was on the Moratorium Steering Committee by legislation to make sure that we got that connection done. Moreover, there was some research that needed to get done. How many fishermen were they, and what kind of walks of life were they from, and et cetera, et cetera. And so Sea Grant was a logical place for that. So as part of the moratorium activity, the legislature also appropriated some funds for research, and so that got administered through the Sea Grant College program, and so I had that role to play as well. And besides that, I think I knew about all of the players, and so communication and interaction amongst the players was also important, and Sea Grant played a role in that as well. And so
did Sea Grant work fairly closely, or act as sort of a liaison between the committee and the research that was going on, as well as the fishermen, the people who were out there fishing every day?
all of the above. As you can imagine, there was a real need to have close interaction of all the parts. And Sea Grant was in a position to do that sort of thing. We administered the research. Now, Sea Grant was already doing some research related to that, so it was a logical marriage there. We had an active extension program, so we were able to interact with the commercial and recreational parts of the fishery. And we were good at getting out information. And one of the age-old problems is it takes a long time to translate research into action. And Sea Grant had a reputation for doing that better and quicker than anyone. And so that was a good part of our role, was information exchange. And then somebody needed to be able to help these subcommittees. We had several subcommittees set up to report back to the Moratorium Steering Committee on various issues like licensing, the identification of the fishing communities, fish facts, all these things. So we had subcommittees that Sea Grant helped to organize and administer.
How was it that Sea Grant was, as you said, so good at getting that information out there broadly and quickly?
How did we do that? I don't. We just did it. We had a network, and we traded on two very important elements. One of them was the truth. If you're a bearer of the truth, you can usually get along pretty well. And so we had a reputation for doing that. And secondly, we thought that information was a necessary ingredient for anything we did. And so we were doing that too. So that it was kind of a natural fit.
Yeah, so you mentioned that yourself and Sea Grant worked with a lot of different stakeholders, between politicians and scientists and commercial and recreational fishers. Do you feel like there was a sense of unity in wanting to pass the Fisheries Reform Act? Was there a lot of division that you noticed?
Well, I think initially there was lots of elements of suspicion. You naturally don't trust politicians. You naturally don't trust bureaucrats. You naturally don't trust university scientists. You naturally don't trust one another. But once we started the moratorium process, the chairman of that moratorium steering committee and also chairman of the Marine Fisheries Commission was a guy named Bob Lucas. Now, Bob Lucas was a personal claims lawyer from Selma, North Carolina. Didn't know squat about fish, but he knew people. And he knew how to be persuasive about things that he believed in. And Bob Lucas really believed, and this is, I think important, that the moratorium process could result in something positive. And if you have a leader who believes that, then lots of things happen. And so that was part of it. But the other is that once we got into this process, and as I say, deliverance of the truth, I think people began to trust one another. And so groups came together. Now, we didn't always agree on everything, but we agreed to disagree sometimes, and we agreed that we could get there if we tried. And sure enough, I think we did. I think what's remarkable about the moratorium process, and it took us a while. I mean, we had a lot of public hearings, about 18 of them, I think, across, most of the state. I don't know how many we went, from Asheville to the coast. And through that process, we began to understand one another. We didn't always come to the same point, but we began to understand one another. And so through that process, the remarkable thing is that when we got to the end, we had about 5 major recommendations. And all 5 of those got approved by the General Assembly. That's a remarkable thing. Probably never happen again. But it did. And I think it happened because we all wanted to do something.
So it sounds like even though people may have disagreed on the different ways of doing things, that there's a general agreement that something had to be done.
That you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, we didn't all agree on all those little things, but we did agree that we ought to do something. Some of our recommendations were compromises, the way it should be. Some of the recommendations were we just one out-argued everybody, and did that happens too. So anyway, we got it done.
What were some aspects of your job in this process that you found difficult or challenging to communicate to the other stakeholders in it?
Well, sometimes, it's nature of research that all your stakeholders don't understand how you're going to do a piece of research. So sometimes it was a little bit difficult to explain what piece of research is going to do and what it would do. I mean, for example, people have a hard time understanding social science research. It's a bunch of soft. Well, in the fisheries issues, that was important. And so we would just say, that's what we're going to do. And here's why we're going to do it. And here's what's going to happen if we do it. And so through that process, we were able to get some, it may not be a tight agreement, but some agreement that, yeah, we can get this done. That was the most difficult part, I think. Another difficulty was trying to reach a conclusion about a recommendation. There's always more than one way to skin a cat. And unless you're willing to compromise and agree on one of those ways to skin that cat, you're not going to ever do it. And so a lot of times we spent some time, and when I say some time, I'm talking about 2 or 3 meetings, arguing about how we were going to reduce the number of commercial fishing licenses, for example. That was a difficult task. It had to be done. At the time we started the moratorium, there were close to 20,000 commercial licenses in existence. Today there are only 2,000 or 3,000. But we had to get that, because not everybody's a commercial fisherman. And there were all these licenses, all kinds. And so we had to get that done. And that was pretty difficult. We also had to develop and define a Marine Fisheries Commission that could actually function. Because remember, we're coming from one that had 19 members where everybody thought they were in there and all this kind of stuff. And we were trying to get down to a 9-member commission, which we did. And that commission, still to this day, has 3 people from the commercial interest, 3 people from recreational interest, and 3 at large. And that was a compromise that people kind of agreed to. Now, 3 plus 3 plus 3 is not always equal. And who's going to appoint those 3 plus 3 plus 3? And we decided that this is going to be high enough level that the governor ought to be doing the appointing. So that's the legislation that we did, and it got approved. So we still do that. Now, lots of fingers get in that pie, and as you know, that's not a clean, direct thing, and all kinds of things can happen. But at least we started out with a clean, balanced commission. I was a member of that commission too, the first one, which was kind of neat.
For how long?
I think I was a fisheries commissioner for 12 years. I think that's what it was. That's 4 terms anyway.
So can you give an example of some of the types of research that your group did to provide information for this project?
Okay, I tell you the projects. One of them was done by Barbara Garrity Blake. You may know her. She and I forget now who her partner was, but anyway, they tried to do an assessment of how people get into the fishery and stay there or get out, or why. Important information, because we're fixing to set up a mechanism here where people are going to have to opt. They're going to have to choose whether they're commercial fishermen or not. Not easy. We had another project done by Mike Orbach and Jeff Johnson on how is our fishery characterized. Who are they? Who are the major commercial types, and so on. So they developed a big chart of what our commercial fishery was. And through that characterization, we were able to set up a licensing structure that we still have today. We had another project, let's see, it was a group of people to do a kind of a social science analysis of how rules and laws and things of that get passed and implemented. Out of that came how do we, what is the commission like? What do they do? How do you appoint them? How many can you have? What do they do? All of these kind of things. And they went about trying to analyze that in the context of how North Carolina operates in our social structure. And then they had what they call focus groups, where they went around and asked people, how do you like that? What if we do this? And through that process, that's how we came up with a 9-member commission. We also came up with how the Marine Fisheries Commission, the Division of Marine Fisheries, the Department of what used to be called Natural Resources and so on, now it's screwed up, but how does that interact? How is this housed in the governance of our state? And what happens if the governor appoints these members versus if the legislature appoints these members, or if there's a joint, all those things. So they did really a nice piece of research on that issue. We may have had a couple of other research projects. I think we did 4 or 5. I've forgotten what they all were, but they were, had to do with how we were going about managing fisheries and manage it in a context of the society in which we live. That's hard.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that the big population growth in North Carolina in the 70s and 80s was a large part of trying to make sense of all these fishing licenses that were out there. What do you think it was about North Carolina in particular, though? Because the South at large was having a big population boom at that time, and North Carolina was, my understanding was that we were sort of one of the first states to put forward something like this.
Yeah, and years after that, we had several other states call and ask us how we did it. So I guess we were pioneers. But North Carolina is a unique place. First of all, geographically and climate, so on, we're sort of everything. We're the part between the subtropical and the northern temperate zones. We're the place where the currents get to come together. We're the most variable place in the world on weather. Cape Hatteras has the most variable weather system of any place anywhere in the world. So we're sort of in a transition zone which we have something of everything. That's a hard place to be. And so that complicated what we do. Let's see, we are the only state that allows trawling and things like that in our inland waters. In fact, we have large acreages of inland waters. North Carolina is the 3rd largest coastal waters in the United States, exceeded only by Alaska and Louisiana. So we're a big player. We have a unique ecosystem. We have a unique social system. We have a unique geographic system. We protrude out into the ocean a long ways, in case you haven't looked. And so here we are. We're kind of a unique place, and so why shouldn't we be unique? We are. Mm-hmm. It's a neat place to be, actually.
Mm-hmm. So, what were some of the major players here? I know you mentioned a couple earlier. Can you, who did you, I guess let's start with who did you work with most directly, but then who were some of the people calling the shots and really helping to get everything organized and getting everything passed?
Well, there's a whole, layering of players. Jim Hunt was governor, and he was a proactive governor, and so he meant for things to get done. Mark Bass-Knight was president pro tem of the Senate, arguably the most powerful politician in North Carolina, and he lived in Wanchese, or Manteo, and so therefore he had more than just a passing interest in coastal issues, and he meant for some things to get done. Didn't necessarily be the same as anybody else, but that he did. We had some influential House members who were coastal representatives who had a large stake in this issue. And we had powerful, what do you want us to call it, interest groups that were coastal oriented, who had influence and connections to the government. So we had all those players in there. And as I told you before, Bob Lucas was a very strong leader type, a very persuasive type individual. And so you mix all that together, you got a lot of big time players doing their thing. It's interesting on one hand, but can be kind of frustrated on the other. But anyway, we had these powerful groups playing in this field. So interacting with them was inevitable. My role as the director of Sea Grant, I mean, I had a relationship with all these folks. Because, as I told you earlier, we were purveyors of the truth. We had a reputation of, you could come and ask Sea Grant a question, you were going to get an honest answer. And so we could be a player without taking a side. And that was really important, because most people take sides somewhere, sometime. And so we worked very hard at not taking a side. In fact, Jerry Shield told me one time that I'd rather have you available even though I may not like you and I may not agree with you, but I need you because you are the only place that we can get the truth. I thought that was a compliment.
It sounded like one.
Yeah. But anyway, we were able to get along with all those folks.
Did you have a lot of either helpful input or maybe pushback from politicians or interest groups that were not directly related to the coast? Did you have a lot of participation from folks representing Piedmont or mountain area counties?
Well, oddly enough, we did. And so it wasn't just a coastal issue. And fisheries is not just a coastal issue, as you well know. I mean, this is a public trust resource, so it should be important to all of us. And sure enough, we had political interest in this issue from a lot of Piedmont type representatives, which was good. Because they could play a role here without having their everyday constituents jumping on their back. And so that, you're right. I mean, that was pretty important.
So, given that fisheries management changes and evolves over time, the same way our coastline changes over time, what do you think about the Fisheries Reform Act's ability to address these changes, things that might come up that you could never have anticipated back in 1997? Do you think that it's sort of flexible enough to bend and adjust?
Well, that's really a good question, because at the time that was one of our issues. I mean, how can we build a system that will work with the change of time? And we thought we did that when we put into the Fisheries Reform Act the Fisheries Management Plan system, where fisheries management plans would be built based on data and catch and all this kind of stuff, and importantly would be reviewed and revised every 5 years. So built in, we try to build into a system here, the Fisheries Management Plan system, a way to deal with changes that would occur in what we thought would be a short term, 5 years. Well, 5 years is a long time for some and short time for others. But that's what we did. We agreed on a 5-year review cycle for the Fisheries Management Plan, thinking that would take care of this changing thing. And we also built into the licensing system a licensing review committee board, so that if you didn't obtain a license, you have an opportunity to do that in the next interim time. another way to build in flexibility as we go on. That works in that works in various ways. There's nothing that's flexible enough, and there's nothing that's too flexible.
Well, what were some of your, I guess, frustrations or major road bumps that you experienced in the process of working with the Moratorium Steering Committee and then the Reform Act itself?
I can't think of any frustrations we had. It was a process, and we knew it was going to take time. I guess the frustrating part was that we thought we could do it in 2 years, and it took 3. That's always a little bit frustrating, but I don't think any of us knew what it was going to be. I mean, how it was going to be. So, but I wouldn't call that a frustrating problem. I mean, it seemed, it worked pretty well. I think if you get enough fair-minded people together, things always work. We had a good committee. The Moratorium Steering Committee was a good committee. I think mainly because care was taken to make sure that all the stakeholders were represented.
Well, what do you think were some of the major successes of the entire process, really, but the outcome as well?
Well, I think 2 or 3 major successes were that we developed and appointed and got a Marine Fisheries Commission that actually worked. And it has pretty much, although there's some criticism of it nowadays about this, that, and the other, but that's probably normal. But I think the most important aspect was the mechanism of developing a fisheries management plan for each of the major species. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds, of course, and no species stands on its own. You develop a plan for shrimp, you got to also consider a few other things as well, because most things eat shrimp, it's part of the food chain for other stuff. But I think developing fisheries management plans, reviewing them and adjusting them was a major success. Now, they haven't always worked exactly the way we thought they would, because we got people involved. But I think it was a major success story.
You think overall it went very well?
Well, I think overall it's worked very well. There have been glitches, and there'll be more. And as time goes on, it probably becomes less and less doable.
What do you mean by less and less doable?
Well, people don't remember what we did in 1996, and so they think we're starting over every time. But I think that as the players change, issues change, outcomes change. And things aren't always smoothly done. There's contentious interactions all the time. One group gets stronger versus another, and then that changes, and then that changes, and then somebody else gets appointed. And I mean, things have a way of just kind of oozing down to, what you call average. In the beginning, we were way up there, but I think it scoots down to kind of average now.
Mm-hmm. You've reached sort of an equilibrium.
Yeah, that's the way it goes.
Well, are there any, any particular areas that you think could have been improved from the get-go, or any particular areas that, 20 years out as we are now, you think maybe could have worked better or should have been done somewhat differently?
Of course there are, but I don't know what they are. We did what we could do then, and I think that was the best we could. I'm not sure that there's anything I would have done differently. of course, there are things that we can do differently. As I told you earlier in this interview, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, and we chose this way. We could have probably done some things differently. I don't know.
Are there any implications of the FRA, 20 years out again, anything that it's caused or any results of it that you wish you had known back then? Besides everything, of course.
Well, I don't know. You wish you'd known who was going to get elected next, or how we were going to do this, that, or the other, or what the things beyond our control, like imports and economics and all of the and what's the federal government going to do, and there were lots of things we didn't know, and lots of things we would never know, and some things we wish they hadn't happened at all, but that's the way it is.
Can you name any of those in particular?
Oh, I don't know. There's a bunch of them. We have, some federal regulations don't exactly square with ours. The propensity to have one size fits all is a problem, because one size doesn't fit all. And you wish you could do things on a more a real-time basis, but that's not possible. It takes, and probably a flaw in how all this worked is that it takes longer to develop a fisheries management plan than we thought it would be. We thought we'd develop a fisheries management plan in 2 or 3 months or something. It takes, a couple of years now? So, there's just things that we didn't really know, and they've been kind of problematic, but we did, overall, pretty good.
Well, what, if anything, that's going on today do you think could or should be changed to ensure a healthier fisheries environment?
Everything. Water quality is a big problem, and currently the way our General Assembly is operating, we're trying to scuttle most of the controls we had. We worked hard to get some of those things into place, like nutrient inputs and sewage treatment and groundwater flows and runoff, and most importantly these natural buffers that they want to do away with now. It took us a long time to get all those in place, and they were there for very good reasons. And most people don't remember how bad it was when the Neuse River turned into a giant fish kill because of excess nutrients from upstream. Most people don't remember the Chatham being, you walk across it because it was so polluted at one time from a manufacturing activity. We got those things changed, and now we're scuttling them right and left. As an aside, I was on a group to enact the Jordan Lake rules. Took us 4 years. Finally got it through the General Assembly. This General Assembly 2 years ago scuttled it in 5 minutes and wasted millions of dollars on solar bees that we knew wouldn't work. And now they want to put in some mussels, but anyway, that's crazy. So we have pollution problems, and we're turning back the clock on that. Habitat destruction, building too close to the water, not having safeguards to keep stuff from running in or caving in, low density development, which we had going well is out the window now, stuff like that. So yeah, we got problems.
Do you think there are any mechanisms in the Fisheries Reform Act or anything that maybe came out of it that might be helpful in addressing some of these issues?
Well, here again, I keep going back to these fisheries management plans. In the beginning, we meant for those to have environmental and water quality parts to it as well. We don't seem to include that much anymore. And through that mechanism, we would have a way to describe what kind of protections we need to have in order to maintain that particular species. So the Fisheries Reform Act Fisheries Management Plan system could be a major mechanism in dealing with how we go about managing that kind of impact. Yeah, it could work.
And since you've mentioned it a few times now, could you tell me sort of the basic components and the process of creating a fisheries management plan?
Well, it starts out with the Marine Fisheries Division setting up a management plan committee. This would have a lead person who has responsibility for that species, plus people who know about the environment, people who know about the economics, people who know about this, that, and the other. I'm not even sure the division has anybody in economics anymore. You know, we used to have that played a role, but I don't think so anymore. I don't have much interaction with them in these days anyway. But that management committee then would set up the elements of the Fisheries Management Plan. That would then be presented to the Marine Fisheries Commission, who would say yay, nay, or hey, why don't you do this? So there was back and forth interaction between the Fisheries Management Plan professionals and the Marine Fisheries Commission manager types, and then this would then be approved by the agency. Somebody in the Secretariat office would be responsible for that. And so by that mechanism, there was give and take early on in the process, and then so all those elements are getting in place, and then you go about filling it in with data and analysis and interactions and all those things, and then this same mechanism would go into play again, where the management committee would put it together, present it to the Marine Fisheries Commission, who would say yay and nay or maybe, present it to the agency, and then ultimately have the General Assembly to approve that plan. And so it's supposed to work that way. It doesn't always work that way.
What would a successful fisheries management plan look like? What would it do exactly, like in an ideal world?
Well, in an ideal world, it would allocate this, like let's take blue crabs, which is one of our more important fisheries. What kind of harvest activity would be related to the blue crab population? What would trigger a change in season or nets or catch or whatever? How would that feed back then into the fishery? And then, how would the economics of that play back? Do you want to harvest all the blue crab this week, flood the market, lower the price? No. And so you have a mechanism in place to do that. There's also another aspect which we could never get through at the time, and there's some talk about it, and that is to allocate catch. Let's say you're a blue crab fisherman and say, okay, you can catch so many 1,000 pounds of blue crab this year. If you want to do it tomorrow, go ahead. If you want to stretch it out over the next 3 months, that's good, and so on. I forget what you call it as a term for that, but so there are lots of ways to put that in there. That's not always the case.
All right. What do do you think the impact of the Fisheries Reform Act was on coastal communities, especially ones that might really rely on some of these recreational fishing licenses that were set up by this act?
I don't know. I think it changed some of those coastal communities. You know, some places along the coast, small fishing villages were pretty much commercial fishery oriented, and with the proliferation of the coastal recreational licenses and increase in interest of that has changed some of those communities from one thing to another. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, I don't know. Somebody smarter than me had to figure that out. But one of the things that happened, and of course Barbara was involved in this too, that as coastal values, property values went up, people who were in traditional kinds of activities became more and more difficult for them to pay the tax amounts and still live there. So that began to affect some of those communities as well. I mean, you can take a place like Calabash, for example, where people moved in and built $1 million houses, and the tax base went up. And if you had been living in a traditional thing over here, your ability to pay went down. And so this tends to change the complexion of the community almost entirely. And so, the regular folk get outvoted. And the regular folk can't afford to live where they've lived anymore. And so on. I mean, the one that Barbara got involved in was trying to get traditional use into the tax structure so that a fish house would be taxed at a different rate than a tourism center. And so she was successful in that. Barbara's a pretty persuasive person.
Sounds like there are a lot of persuasive people involved with the FRA.
Yeah, but anyway, I think the complexion of the whole coastal area changed. I'm not sure the Fisheries Reform Act is responsible for that. I think that this is inevitable. I think the Fisheries Reform Act helped us be able to manage some of that, which, I guess is a plus, but it was tough.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're thinking that a lot of this change was sort of already in progress or sort of inevitable, and that the Fisheries Reform Act maybe helped manage something that was already coming.
Well, it was already coming. So the Fisheries Reform Act didn't have anything to do with that. But I do think that the Fisheries Reform Act gave us some mechanisms to manage within it. If you take, population growth in North Carolina has been pretty high. And so if you're putting more and more people into the same place, they're going to get crowded. And I keep telling people that since recreational fishing effort, for example, has quadrupled in the last 25 years, then you should actually be entitled to catch only 1/4 of the fish you used to catch, right? I mean, if you got 4 times as many people, then you ought to be that's not what everybody thinks. I mean, everybody thinks they ought to catch the same amount of fish. Well, that's not possible. And so the Fisheries Reform Act has helped us to manage that. Not perfect, not even near, but it has helped.
What do you think were some of the impacts the Fisheries Reform Act had on commercial fishers in the state?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I think most of the commercial fishermen tell you that it didn't help them any. But I think it helped them a lot. We reduced the number of people who thought they were commercial fishing, 20,000 down to whatever it was, 4 or 5,000. We're now down to about 2,500 or whatever it is. But so we kind of cleaned that up. I think the Fisheries Management Plans, and they won't agree to this, gave them a more predictable, number of fish. I think that the environmental safeguards protected some habitat that wouldn't have been protected in the first place, and so on. So I think overall the FRA has been beneficial to the commercial fishery. I don't think all of them would agree to that.
And why not?
Well, I think it's easier to blame the government than it is to blame yourself or elements or the fish.
Do you think ensuring a healthy fisheries environment while ensuring healthy growth in coastal communities are perhaps mutually exclusive goals, or do you think that they could work together?
Oh, I've always thought they could work together, and I spent my whole since childhood trying to figure out how to do that. But so I think they can work together. How and in what ways is incredibly complicated situation. But yes, otherwise I probably wouldn't be doing what I did. I believed.
Good. Let's see. What do you think, 20 years out, what do you think are some of the things that the politicians and legislatures and interest groups might be able to learn from just the process of creating the steering committee and the Reform Act?
You're implying something that may not be available from the evidence, that they would actually want to care about doing that. I think that a review of this process and how it operated could be a very useful thing. However, the political climate nowadays is so polarized that they wouldn't even dare to do that. We'd rather say, no, it's all bad, than to do anything with it.
So you felt the political climate was less polarized then?
Oh, much less polarized. We actually had bipartisan support, and we actually had bipartisan working together to get something done. That's not the case today. If one party mentions one thing, then it's automatically bad by the other party. And so we get all these people spending all their time tearing down something that they don't know anything about or don't want to know anything about. And fisheries management, by the way, is an incredibly complicated process. So that would take some effort on their part, which they don't seem to want to do either. Okay.
So you had mentioned that there was a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of people agreeing to disagree, and generally being able to work together decently well. Do you have any particular stories about working with certain folks that you'd like to share?
None that I'd want to tell. Well, I guess the main story is that back in those days, which I call the good old days, but if you wanted to get something done, you could usually go down to the General Assembly and have a actual reasonable conversation about whatever it was. I knew Mark Bass-Knight long before he became a state senator. He was married to the daughter of Hughes Tillett, who was my first extension agent in coastal North Carolina. So I could call Mark and talk to him about things. I don't know anybody to call these days, and if I did, I wouldn't know what to say to him. So I don't know. That's the only story I know, is that we were able to do things when reasonable people wanted to do things.
Mm-hmm. So you think that communication?
It's gone. Mm-hmm. Everybody's suspicious of everybody, which is too bad. I mean, this is not just a North Carolina problem. This is a national problem. I mean, it's worse in Washington, D.C. I used to go up to Washington to the U.S. Senate, to talk about sea grant support, and Senator Claiborne Pell used to say, "Hey, come on in here in my office and tell me some stories about Jesse Helms. I need some things on him that I could use." And so, those days are gone too. I mean, Claiborne Pell was a liberal Democrat, and Jesse Helms was a conservative Republican, but they were friends. That's not the case today.
And what effect do you think that might have on fisheries and the health of, fish stock in North Carolina and water quality?
Well, I think it's going to make things worse. Some of these environmental issues, which are going to get scuttled because of some misinformed position. Somebody who's more powerful than somebody else will get their way, and so on. I mean, they practice the golden rule, Then what got the gold rules. And so I think things are going to get worse before they get better. I keep thinking that one of these days the general public is going to wake up and say, we need to get rid of this bunch. But that's not happening.
So what did you touched on this briefly at the beginning of the interview, but can you talk a little bit about your career after the Fisheries Reform Act?
I don't know that I had one. Well, after the Fisheries Reform Act, I went back to the academic department at NC State and taught a couple of courses, and one of the courses I taught was what do we call it? Anyway, it had to do with policy and politics and facts. So it was a course we chose 12 different issues and examined those from what was the issue and pros and cons of that, what was the policy, and then how was that influenced by the politics. And I had students from NC State, Chapel Hill, and Duke, and so we had a great discussion. We met one night a week and for 3 hours or whatever it was, and talk about these issues. And I'd have guest speakers come in, somebody who'd come and talk about the Fisheries Reform Act, for example, and then how that played through the process, and then have the students discuss how they would do that and what they would do and how it would work out. It was a lot of fun, and I think we all learned something. So that was one course I taught. I went back and taught an old course that I used to before I got into Sea Grant a long time ago, called Estuarine Ecology, Coastal Ecology. And so talked about coastal ecosystems and how they function and what they bring for us. That was fun too. So then I became the graduate student administrator, so started, bringing in graduate students and processing them and getting them through to a degree. The goal was to reduce the amount of time that graduate students took from the time they entered graduate school until they got a degree. It was getting a little long. Everybody's feeling comfortable sitting in there, So I kind of hurried them along a little bit.
Did you have a lot of students who were interested in getting into sort of the same field as you know, working with fisheries management?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, you know, these kind of things, if you do something that other people recognize, then that begets other people. I mean, it kind of draws in folks. So yeah, it worked okay.
Do you think there's still a good number of graduates coming out of these programs looking to get into?
Oh, I don't know about now. There, I mean, there's some opportunities. I think there's some good things going on down in Morehead City now with the cooperation of Duke and UNC and NC State. That's good. This sort of stuff is bigger than any one institution. And the idea was, in the old days, to get all these institutions working together. That works okay, except on Saturday afternoon on the football field or Monday night in the basketball court. But other than that, it works pretty good. Yeah. Well, I think there's a program now where graduates I think it's supported jointly by Sea Grant and by the division, where a student can get an assistantship to work on a fisheries management problem. That's good.
Do you have, I guess, any other stories or a retrospective on the process or the results that you'd like to talk about?
I've forgotten all my good stories. most of the people I tell them about have died and gone away. So you don't want to disturb.
You can make them anonymous.
Yeah, you don't want to disturb those folks, but I don't know. Well, one thing I did get involved in back in Governor Hunt's first term. He set up what's called a Coastal Water Management Task Force, and I got appointed to that by him and a guy named Joe Phillips. I don't know if you heard of Joe Phillips or not, but he was the held some position down in state geologist or something. I don't know, but anyway. But our goal was to try to figure out a way to manage water in the coast to protect the environment while giving people an opportunity to farm or drink or whatever. So we set up a stakeholders committee to deal with that. And Joe Phillips and I traveled most of coastal North Carolina. If any civic club or any garden club or anybody else wanted us, we'd come and talk about water management. One night I showed up in Engelhard. You know where Engelhard is. It's sort of out there.
Yeah.
And so we go in and I get introduced to speak. And the guy in the back held up his hand. Dr. Copeland, have you come in here with your mind already made up, or do you want to know something from us? And I said, well, I haven't made up my mind about anything, and I would like to hear what y'all have to say. And he said, okay, you can go ahead and speak now.
You just needed to make sure.
It could have been a hostile audience, but it turned out to be, the interaction was really great. And we did learn a bunch of things from, these were black land farmers who drained a lot of land, and we were concerned about that drainage impacting habitat, So it was kind of interesting. You learn a lot of things. Another time I went to this guy's place and explained to him what we were doing, and he listened very kindly, very nicely. And finally, when I got done, he looked up at me and he says, "Sound to me like you guys just looking for something to do."
Like you're just bored.
And so,
Oh my.
it's pretty good. I used to go, I told him that Sea Grant cost every man, woman, and child in North Carolina 35 cents each year. And if I got done talking about what we were doing and how we were doing it, and they didn't feel like they got their 35 cents worth, I'd be glad to give it to them. Nobody ever took me up.
That's great.
Nobody ever asked for 35 cents back. So.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier that you held a lot of public hearings related to the fisheries reform and the moratorium.
Yes, we did.
Was there anything really surprising or interesting that you learned there from
Yeah.
the public?
Lots of things. I mean, it's an age-old problem. When the government tries to do something for you, they don't ever listen to anybody they're going to do it to, right? And the most important thing you can do is to find out what their thoughts are. And so, yeah, we went to all these places. Now, a couple of times it was a little bit hostile because they thought we were in there to take their fish away. And people got a little bit excited about that. And like, I don't know, Jewel Wheatley, he's dead now, but Jewel was a member of the Fisheries Commission. He also owns what's called Beaufort Fisheries, processed menhaden. And we took turns about chairing these public hearings. And so Jewel was on the Moratorium Steering Committee, and it's his turn to be the chair. And since he knew all those people down east in Carteret County, he'd just be the chair of that. Well, Jewel is kind of a polarizing individual to start with. And he walked into that room and they pounced on him. Turncoat, et cetera, et cetera. And they wound up calling him the Ayatollah of the fisheries. We thought we were going to get the
Oh my gosh.
law in there to rescue Jewel out of that meeting, but it finally quieted down and we finally got some interaction going, but Jewel had them instantly excited.
Oh Lord.
Yeah, Ayatollah. So we called him Ayatollah after that for quite a while.
What were people concerned about from the get-go there?
They were afraid that we were going to take their fish away.
They thought that y'all were basically coming in to say you can't fish anymore?
Yeah. And rightfully they took issue with that. But, generally speaking, what we would do in a hearing was to begin the meeting with an explanation about what we were up to. Well, Jewel didn't quite have that down. And the longer Jewel talked, the more they got upset.
That's an important part to have down when you start.
One needs to have that pretty straight. And, from the standpoint of the folks, they need to know what do you guys want? Yeah, like the guy in Englehart. You come in here with your mind already made up, or do you want to hear what we have to say? Mm-hmm. Interesting question. Important one. So Jewel failed to do that, and he paid the price. But the other thing was that we held hearings in commercial fishing villages, in tourism centers, and as we went across the state with like the bass fishermen of Piedmont or something. I mean, some recreational fishing clubs and things of that sort of thing. You had a little bit different perspective from those types of people. But all in all, you would finally get down to the real issue, and that is we don't have enough fish to go around. And so let's get on with something other here that's going to get us where we want to go. So you got to kind of interact a little bit.
Did you find that there were certain communities or sort of interest groups that were, from the get-go, a bit warmer to the idea?
Oh yeah. I mean, some places, it's hard to warm up at all. But yes, I mean, people have a lot of preconceived ideas. People already know what they want to do. They don't want somebody else telling them what it is they're going to do, and so on. There's a lot of that sort of thing.
What types of people generally did you find were sort of like hesitant at first?
Yeah, Some were, well, most of them go ahead and tell you. But, the idea was to have some interaction. I mean, the purpose of public hearing is not just to hear. Purpose is to have some interaction so that you can actually work something out. Doesn't often happen, but that's what you're supposed to be doing. But yeah, I mean, the public hearings were interesting, and we had a lot of them. We spent, I guess, over 2 years doing this.
And was that right from the get-go?
Yeah, I mean, it took a while.
Well, do you have anything else you'd like to share about your time in this process, or something that led up to it, or something that you've noticed in the intervening 20 years?
Oh, I never finished the question you had about my career after retirement. I retired, and we built this place here, so I started farming. So I, had cows and all that kind of stuff. So that took some of my time. But I also got appointed to the Chatham County Planning Board. And I'm still on the Chatham Planning Board. This is my last term. I can't be reappointed again, so this is it. But I've been there for 10 years. And Chatham County is related to Wake and Orange County in that they keep pushing into our county. And we try to maintain a rural character here, but that's being pushed further and further and further south. And now with the new development around Pittsburgh, it's going to be different. I started to say awful, but it's going to be different. And so we're dealing with how do we manage this surge in development and the encroaching of big time towns like Cary and Chapel Hill, and now Apex as well. And so it's been an interesting time. That keeps me off the street, things to do. I also been very active in church work. I'm chairman of the board of our church and do a lot of things there. And of course, I was on the Marine Fisheries Commission until 4 or 5 years ago. And let's see, what else do I do? Oh, I have a garden, if you didn't notice. And all around jolly good fellow.
Yeah, so mentioning all these things that you've done since then, you've been involved in so many other groups, sort of advocacy groups and organizational committees. What did you personally sort of learn from the whole process of the Fisheries Reform Act that you've carried forward into your work?
Listen. Main thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like I told somebody just yesterday, in fact, I'm not going to argue with you about your opinion as long as you got one. And what people need to remember is that we're all in this game together. And that's how it was with the Fisheries Reform Act. And we're not going to get to the end of that game unless we learn to understand one another. And so that's the biggest lesson. And of course, I learned some of that on the Coastal Water Management Task Force as well. I mean, you got to listen to these folks. They have a firm commitment in where they live. I mean, I have a firm commitment here. You don't come in here and tell me what to do in my place. We may sit and talk about that. But, we're going to have to listen to one another, and we're going to have some sharing of information. That's an important lesson, and we don't do enough of that. In fact, nowadays we don't do much of it at all. And that's disappointing. I mean, as I told you, I'm chairman of the board at church. You can ask a question at a church meeting, and there is absolutely zero response. I mean, I don't understand. But people don't want to get involved in argument. They'd rather just have their mind made up and go do it, and if you don't like it, shoot me. It's crazy.
Yeah, so you think just sort of, because you had mentioned earlier about how this dialogue and just talking was so important and being able to communicate, and it sounds like before that you just need to listen, learn how to listen.
And that sounds easy, but that's not easy to do. Okay? I mean, it's not easy to listen to somebody else's opinion, because I already know what's correct. I mean, you know. And so that's difficult to do. But we must learn how to do it. No, I fear for our grandchildren, because things aren't going to get better anytime soon. Well, I mean, you know, what is the population of the earth? 9 billion now?
Something like that.
Or 7? No, it's 7.5 billion. It's going to be 9 billion in 2030. So, yeah, so
Somewhere between those two.
yeah, and 3 billion of them are hungry. What are we going to do? You know, technology can't solve all that. We're going to change our way somehow. And I don't see us changing our way much. Not soon enough, anyway. I shouldn't worry. I'm 80 years old. I'm not gonna last that long.
It's better to worry than to just let it be a problem.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the way it is these days.
This might be a bit redundant of a question, but what's sort of your hope for the future of fisheries in North Carolina in particular?
Well, my hope is that we will improve the environment and maintain fisheries populations at some sustainable level. My hope is that we'll be able to live with the allocation process, and someday begin to figure out a way that we can balance that. That's my hope.
Oh, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I like your project. I think it's a great idea. Hello to Barbara and Susan and Jimmy. I mean, you know, it's been a while. And so, good folks. You're in good company.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and shut this off.